Yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Velasquez, designated Velasquez number 1. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the amendment designated Velasquez number 1 will be postponed. Pursuant to the markup notice, it is now in order to consider H.R. 6085 to prohibit the implementation of the draft resource management plan and environmental impact statement for the Rock Springs RMP revision, Wyoming, and for other purposes. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Federal Lands is discharged from further consideration of the bill. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Does any member wish to be recognized for purpose of debate on the bill? Ms. Hageman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In late August of this year, the Bureau of Land Management released its newly proposed resource management plan for the Rock Springs Field Office Planning Area in Wyoming. This proposed plan has been of significant interest to everyone living in or near the planning area, which is why the BLM received over 35,000 comments during the public comment period after the draft EIS was released in 2023. The planning area is located in portions of Lincoln, Sweetwater, Uinta, Sublette, and Fremont counties in southwest Wyoming and encompasses approximately 3.6 million acres of public land. This is a very unpopular proposal in Wyoming. The sheer impact of this unprecedented shift in land management priorities is so significant that state, local, and congressional officials have adamantly opposed it from its inception. We've since learned much more about the process by which the BLM developed this plan, and what we found regarding the planning process is shocking, to say the least. A former BLM employee who worked on developing the 4 alternatives considered in the RMP, and Mr. James Evans, testified in front of the Wyoming State Legislature's Joint Federal Natural Resources Management Committee on the process of developing the Rock Springs RMP, and said that the BLM's initial preferred alternative was put together in just 1 week and was supposed to be, quote, the bookend alternative. Keep in mind, this is for a process that took over 13 years. The BLM at one time actually directed the cooperators not to focus on this alternative B at all, and no one did for the 10-plus years in which the RMP was being developed. The BLM employee also testified that, quote, the science and the work to do the RMP was all done on alternative D, end quote. So we have a former BLM employee testifying that almost no work was put into what the BLM announced a year ago was its preferred alternative, while rejecting the only alternative, alternative D, that had received the requisite analysis and scrutiny as required by both the Federal Land Policy Management Act and NEPA. Additionally, in our House Natural Resources Subcommittee on Federal Lands hearing earlier this year, the Public Lands Director of Sweetwater County, Mr. Eric Bingham, continued to reinforce the fact that BLM's preferred alternative was never adequately studied and was never intended to be chosen as the management plan for 3.8 million acres in southwest Wyoming. And now here we are with the BLM attempting to implement what remains largely the very alternative B that was never studied, an alternative that is not only entirely inadequate in terms of scientific analysis, but the alternative that is the most tyrannical. The BLM has tried to cover up its violation of FLPA and NEPA by claiming that its recently proposed RMP and final EIS is a mashup of alternatives B and D, admitting that it has continued to rely on a bookend alternative that was developed in the course of 1 week over 10 years ago to implement a management plan on 3 million acres. From the time the draft EIS and final EIS were released, it became clear that the BLM was much more interested in hearing to the comments and complaints of green NGOs than the concerns of the people of Wyoming. This fact is perhaps best demonstrated by the agency's decision to scale back certain right-of-way restrictions, not because of the fact that such restrictions would be devastating providing affordable and reliable energy to the rest of the country, but only because the enviros express concern over the lack of availability for so-called green energy projects, the transmission lines to take what limited electricity is produced by failing wind turbines out of state to places like California. Even with these adjustments, however, we're looking at an increase of right-of-way exclusion and avoidance areas from 921,000 acres, which is a 100% increase over the existing plan, and over 1 million acres in another area, respectively. While the current RMP has 540,000 acres close to leasing, the new proposal closes leasing on approximately 1.1 million acres, a doubling of the acreage close to leasing compared to current restrictions. Areas of critical environmental concern, or ACECs, which are supposed to be designated only when an area meets relevant criteria, are heavily distorted in the BLM proposal. The administration is using the BLM land planning process to prevent leasing from occurring and to ban fracking. I guess that Pennsylvania can simply look to what the Biden-Harris administration is doing in Wyoming to understand what a Harris administration would do there. We don't need to rely on her flip-flopping. We can see what her agencies are doing right now. In addition, this new plan also reduces the acreage available for grazing. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation, which will prevent the BLM from implementing this political RMP and require the BLM to return to the drawing board to develop a management plan that actually complies with FLPMA and NEPA. And I would also like to introduce several documents for the record. First, the letter submitted by the City of Rock Springs, a letter submitted by the Board of County Commissioners of Sweetwater County, a letter submitted by the National Mining Association, an editorial entitled "Controversial BLM Rock Springs Plan Could Devastate Tourism," boosters say, an article by Kat Urbikite, "The BLM is tired of misinformation about the Rock Springs plan, but the plan itself is misinformation," a letter from the Essential Minerals Association, and a letter from Southwest Wyoming Regional Airport, all addressed to the failed policy and the illegal policies and procedure followed by BLM in adopting the RMP that is the subject of my bill. With that, I yield back.
Without objection, so moved. Thank you, Ms. Hageman. Appreciate it. Is there further discussion on the bill? Yes. Chair recognizes Ms. Kamlager-Dove.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I oppose H.R. 6085. This bill would prevent the Secretary of the Interior from being able to finalize, implement, administer, or enforce the proposed resource management plan and environmental impact statement for the BLM land managed by the Rock Springs Field Office in Wyoming. BLM's Rock Springs Field Office covers over 3.5 million acres of federal surface and subsurface estate in southwestern Wyoming. The region is home to oil, gas, renewable energy development, wildlife habitat, outdoor recreation, wild horses, grazing, and historic trails. For more than 25 years, it has been managed by the same long outdated resource management plan. So it makes sense that BLM pursued updates, first by putting out a notice of intent to develop a new RMP in 2011, and then by publishing a draft EIS in August 2023. What we're discussing today is the proposed RMP and final EIS that BLM published on August 23rd of this year. Between the draft and final EIS, BLM held 3 in-person public meetings, received more than 35,000 public comments, and worked closely with a task force appointed by the governor of Wyoming. Let's review what's in the proposed RMP, which is the result of significant stakeholder collaboration. The preferred alternative in the draft EIS would have closed 61% of the field office to oil and gas. The proposed RMP and final EIS restrict oil and gas on only 30% of the land. The preferred alternative in the draft EIS would have closed all the field office's land to coal development. The proposed RMP restricts coal development only in select sensitive areas, which amount to about 25% of the land. Contrary to certain talking points, the RMP only restricts grazing on a little over 2,000 acres of the more than 3.5 million available. The proposed RMP allows for renewable energy where appropriate and promotes conservation by designating 12 areas of critical environmental concern. This resource management plan is a common sense and overdue update that follows proper procedure, including community input and sound science. It balances infrastructure and energy needs with protections for important wildlife habitats, recreation areas, and cultural areas. This bill would undo it all because the fossil fuel industry wants more. That's not a good enough reason. I oppose this bill and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the bill? I recognize myself to speak in support of H.R. 6085, sponsored by Representative Hageman, which would withdraw the Resource Management Plan, or RMP, for the Rock Springs Field Office in Wyoming, finalized last month by the BLM. I know Representative Hageman has spoken extensively on this. I would associate myself with her remarks, encourage my colleagues to support the legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Hearing none, it is now in order to consider amendments to H.R. 6085. And I recognize the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman, for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute designated Hageman 293 ANS. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Ms. Hageman, the floor is yours.
The amendment in the nature of the substitute is the similar bill to what we had previously, almost identical. The only change is actually identifying the final proposed RMP and EIS as being the documents and the policy that would be blocked by this legislation. Other than that, it's identical to the previous bill that we offered. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the ANS? I recognize myself, also speak in support of Representative Hageman's ANS. And as she mentioned, it is needed to reflect the most recent publication of the RMP in the Federal Register from last month. I yield back and ask, is there any further discussion on the amendment? If there is none further discussion on the amendment, then it is now in order to consider amendments to the ANS. I recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Kamala Dove, to present the amendment on behalf of Mr. Huffman, designated Huffman number 1. Without objection, the amendment is considered read.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I mentioned, before BLM's recent update, the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan hadn't been updated in over 25 years. Naturally, as the BLM is supposed to do according to its foundational mandate, they updated it. And it certainly wasn't some top-down authoritarian plan as the bill sponsor would have you believe. BLM conducted public in-person meetings, collected 35,000 public comments over an extended public comment period, and coordinated with the governor through an appointed task force. The proposed RMP clearly weighs the interests of many communities and stakeholders across the state. The initial preferred alternative had proposed closing over 2 million acres to oil and gas leasing, whereas the updated RMP closes about half that, at a little over 1 million acres. The initial preferred alternative proposed closing 3.5 million acres to coal leasing. The updated RMP only closes around 750,000 acres to coal leasing. The proposed plan balances opportunities to use and develop public lands while conserving important and sensitive areas. Unfortunately for the bill sponsor, not everyone agrees that we should give away as much land as possible to the fossil fuel industry. Some stakeholders want protections for renowned wildlife habitats, cultural areas, hunting, fishing, and recreation. Some stakeholders want to see a balanced approach to energy development. Let's be clear, more than 60% of the lands within the Rock Springs planning area have already been leased, over 1.7 million acres. Much of the area that BLM closed to oil and gas leasing has low potential for development. BLM's public scoping period revealed growing public concern about the rate and scale of oil and gas leasing and development in the planning area. And according to BLM, there are no outstanding or pending applications for federal coal leases or exploration licenses on lands within the planning areas. So my colleague's amendment requires that before this act can take effect, the Secretary must complete a 90-day public comment period and receive input from all the stakeholders that BLM heard from and thoughtfully considered. The Rock Springs RMP was developed with thorough input from the industry, impacted communities, and the state government. This bill would undermine it all at the behest of polluting industries. I urge the adoption of this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Hageman, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment. Can you imagine if we required the federal government to initiate a public comment process every time it chose not to go forward with what's a really bad idea? The gentleman from California must not understand why the public comment period exists in the first place. It exists because federal agencies like the BLM think that they can do whatever they want. Yet the very foundation of our government is one of, by, and for the people. And it's our job in Congress and the job of our American citizens to hold agencies like the BLM accountable and to make sure that they act within the bounds that the law sets for them. The BLM doesn't have a right to lie to people like they did to the Rock Springs City Council, Sweetwater County, state officials, and the citizens of Wyoming. They lied to them when they told them they were identifying an alternative as an outlier that wouldn't actually be taken into consideration, and then later adopting that alternative as the preferred alternative for the management of 3.8 million acres of land. The RMP at issue here is made up of almost all of the entire aspect of Alternative B, which was an alternative that as long ago as 2013, the BLM said would not be considered. The people of Wyoming have already spoken on this issue. I've had dozens and dozens of people and groups meet with me and my staff asking that we put a stop to what the BLM is doing here. I've only had one organization come and express any kind of support at all for the proposed RMP. Since the gentleman from California is so concerned about the fact that we in Congress are inserting ourselves into this process, I'd invite him to review the facts put forward by the City of Rock Springs and others and review the documents that I have submitted into the record. The City of Rock Springs is just one of the many stakeholders that worked on the RMP for over a decade, only to have those efforts thrown out the window at the last minute by the radicals in the Biden and Harris administration. The BLM lied to the City of Rock Springs and others by telling them that they would not use this unstudied alternative. And now, after this entire process of our cities, our airports, our small businesses, and our residents begging for the withdrawal of this rule, we have a sitting member of Congress suggesting that it's incumbent on the people to prove once again that the BLM has violated the law and failed to follow FLPMA as well as NEPA. The development of this RMP has been a nightmare process, but most specifically since the Biden-Harris administration came into office. FLPMA requires the BLM to coordinate the land use inventory planning and management activities of or for public lands with the land use planning and management programs of the states and local governments within which the lands are located. In other words, local governments must be provided with an opportunity to be involved early in the process to provide advice and recommendations. Unfortunately, as we have seen here, the BLM has entirely ignored the input and the information provided by the stakeholders in Wyoming and have pursued a radical agenda of trying to limit our access, management, and use to almost 3.8 million acres of land in southwestern Wyoming. The amendment being offered by Mr. Huffman does not improve the bill. It actually just further extends a failed process, and I encourage my colleagues to vote against it. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. I do appreciate that this amendment recognizes the importance of listening to